Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that lingers long after the lights go out. A huge thank you to every one of you who's been with us through these journeys into the unexplained. Drop a comment right now and let me know, where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Are you curled up in a quiet city apartment, or maybe out in the countryside where the woods press a little closer? Tell me. I read every single one, and it makes these late-night tales feel like we're all sitting around the same campfire. Now, picture the year 1952. The war was already a fading memory for most of America, but in the hollows of Appalachia, time moved slower, thicker, like molasses in winter. Coal was still king, though its crown was tarnished. Mines closed one by one, leaving men like Vernon Barlow scraping by on odd jobs, garden patches, and the stubborn pride that kept mountain families rooted no matter how hard the land pushed back. Barlow Hollow wasn't just a name on a faded map, it was blood deep. Vernon's people had farmed and hunted its ridges since before the Civil War, carving a life from the same steep slopes where laurel thickets tangled like secrets and creeks ran cold and clear year-round. Vernon himself was 38 that autumn, a quiet man with broad shoulders shaped by years swinging an axe and shouldering timber. His wife, Ruth, had come from Virginia coal country herself, but the mountain life had worn her thin. She kept the house spotless, baked cornbread that could make a man forget his troubles for a minute, and tried to hold the family together the way mountain women always had, through sheer will and quiet prayer. Their daughters, Sarah and Mary, were 12 years old and mirror images of each other. Dark braids that swung like pendulums when they ran, freckles scattered across cheeks that still carried the roundness of childhood, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, watchful and full of mischief. Identical twins, people called them the Barlow girls, as if they were one soul split between two bodies. They finished each other's sentences, shared the same worn pair of Sunday dresses, and dreamed aloud about moving to the city someday where streetlights never went out, and no one had to listen for the sound of a coal truck rattling down the holler. That Friday in late October, the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Vernon had been promising the girls this trip for weeks. "Just us three," he'd said over supper, his voice low and steady the way it got when he was trying to sound cheerful. "Barlow Hollow's our place. We'll camp by the big white oak, roast some sausages, and maybe catch us a few trout for breakfast." Ruth had glanced up from her mending, worry flickering across her face like a shadow. The hollow had a reputation. Nothing you could put a finger on, just old stories the grandmothers told about lights moving between the trees at night, and voices that sounded too much like children laughing where no children should be. But Vernon waved it off. "It's family land," he said. "Nothing out there is going to hurt my girls." The truck rattled along the rutted dirt road that wound deeper into the mountains, its tires kicking up red dust that settled on everything. Sarah and Mary bounced in the bed, legs dangling over the tailgate, singing the same hymn they'd learned in the one-room schoolhouse. Their voices rose sweet and clear against the backdrop of maples turning flame, red and the deep green of pine that never changed. Vernon drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the shotgun he always kept behind the seat, just in case a bear wandered too close or a copperhead decided the path looked inviting. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror at his daughters, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a few hours, the weight of unpaid bills and the empty mine shafts up the road lifted. This was going to be good for them. They reached the hollow by late afternoon. The sun slanted low through the trees, painting the clearing in gold. The white oak stood like a sentinel at the center, massive, ancient, its branches spreading wide enough to shelter half the family if trouble came. Vernon pitched the heavy canvas tent while the girls gathered kindling, their laughter echoing off the ridges. They stacked rocks for a fire ring, unrolled wool blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs and home, and helped their father string a line for the lantern. Supper was simple: fried potatoes from the garden, sausages speared on green sticks, and apples they'd picked on the way in. The fire crackled, sending sparks skyward like tiny stars trying to join the real ones that were just beginning to prick through the deepening blue. As darkness settled, the hollow changed. The temperature dropped fast the way it does in the mountains, and the trees seemed to lean in closer. Sarah and Mary huddled under one blanket, whispering secrets and giggling about the boys at school. Vernon sat a little apart, whittling a piece of hickory into a small whistle for each of them, the shavings curling at his boots. He told them stories his own father had told him, about the first Barlow who settled here after fleeing the flatlands, about how the land gave and took in equal measure. The girls listened wide-eyed, the firelight dancing across their identical faces. Later, when the embers had burned low and the lantern hissed softly inside the tent, Vernon lay awake listening to his daughter's even breathing. The hollow felt alive around them. Owls calling, leaves rustling, the distant rush of the creek. He thought about Ruth back home, probably sitting by the window with her Bible open, worrying the way she always did. He thought about how proud the girls had looked carrying their packs, how the trip was supposed to stitch their little family tighter. But the hollow had other plans. Something shifted in the dark beyond the tent flap, just a branch snapping, or maybe the wind. Vernon told himself it was nothing. He closed his eyes, trusting the land that had always been theirs. He had no idea that by morning, only one of them would walk out of Barlow Hollow alive. The fire had burned down to glowing coals by the time Vernon finally drifted off. The canvas tent felt snug against the chill that crept in from the ridges, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and damp earth. Sarah and Mary lay curled together like they had since they were babies, their breathing soft and synchronized, the kind of rhythm only twins seemed to share. Vernon's last conscious thought was a quiet gratitude that, for one night, the worries of the company store debt and the closed mine shafts up the road felt distant, swallowed by the ancient quiet of Barlow Hollow. Sometime deep in the blackest hours, just past when the moon had slipped behind the tallest peak, a sound pulled him awake. Not a scream, not exactly. More like a whisper carried on the wind, two voices overlapping in perfect harmony, calling his name the way the girls sometimes did when they were playing hide and seek in the garden back home. "Daddy, come see." It was faint, almost playful, but something in it made the hair on his arms rise. He sat up, heart thudding against his ribs, and reached for the lantern. The tent flap hung open, just a crack. He was sure he'd tied it shut. Outside, the white oak loomed larger in the darkness, its branches creaking like old bones. "Sarah? Mary?" His voice came out rough with sleep. No answer, only the creek murmuring in the distance and the soft rustle of leaves that sounded too deliberate, too close. Vernon grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun, his boots crunching on the frost-kissed ground as he stepped out. The clearing looked unchanged at first, the fire ring cold now, the blankets still spread where the girls had been sitting earlier, but the tent was empty behind him. Their wool blankets lay tossed aside, one small shoe print pressed into the soft dirt near the tree line, heading toward the thicker laurel thickets that swallowed the hollow's secrets. Panic rose slow and cold in his chest, the way floodwater creeps up a holler after heavy rain. He called louder, voice echoing off the ridges, bouncing back distorted. "Girls!" This ain't funny. He swept the flashlight beam in wide arcs, the yellow circle cutting through mist that hadn't been there at supper. The woods felt different now, denser, watchful. Old mountain stories his grandmother used to tell flickered through his mind, haints that lured children with voices like kin, the hollow itself breathing and taking what it wanted when families grew too proud of their land. But those were just tales for keeping young uns close to the porch after dark. This was real. His girls were out there. Vernon plunged into the underbrush, thorns snagging his shirt and scratching his arms as he pushed deeper. The ground sloped sharply, roots twisting like fingers trying to trip him. He shouted until his throat burned, stopping every few yards to listen. Once he thought he heard giggling. Light, identical, the sound that usually filled their tiny kitchen when they chased each other with dish towels. It came from uphill, then downhill, then seemed to circle behind him. The flashlight beam caught fleeting shapes, pale flashes between trees that vanished when he turned. His scratches deepened as he clawed through briars, blood mixing with sweat on his skin. Hours blurred. The sky lightened to a bruised gray, but the mist only thickened, turning the familiar hollow into a labyrinth. Vernon's voice grew hoarse, raw with desperation. He circled back to the camp again and again, each time hoping to see two small figures waiting by the dead fire, grinning at their prank. But the tent stayed empty. The white oak stood silent sentinel, its massive trunk unmarked except for the faint carving the girls had made earlier with his pocketknife, S+M+Daddy, 1952. By the time the sun finally burned through the haze, Vernon Barlow was no longer the steady mountain man who had driven them in laughing the day before. His clothes hung in tatters, face streaked with dirt and blood from dozens of shallow scratches that looked like they'd been made by small, frantic hands or something with claws. His eyes were wide and wild, pupils dilated with exhaustion and something deeper. He staggered out of the hollow on foot, leaving the truck behind, shotgun forgotten somewhere in the brush. The nearest neighbor's place was 3 miles down the rutted road, a long, stumbling journey where he muttered the whole way. What the hollow took, it took him. Called him by name, laughing like always. But the trees, they moved. Whispered back. His words spilled out in fragments to the first person he met, old Widow Hargrove, who took one look at him and ran inside for her shotgun, thinking a bear had got him. But Vernon kept babbling as she helped him to a chair on her porch. Sarah and Mary, gone into the dark. I followed the voices. Hollow opened up and swallowed 'em whole. Ain't no tracks. Just took what was mine. Word spread fast in the way it does in tight-knit Appalachian communities where everyone is kin by blood or by hardship. By midday, men from the scattered farms and the remnants of the old coal camp were gathering with lanterns and dogs, rifles slung over shoulders. The sheriff from the county seat arrived by late afternoon, a tired man named Wilkes, who'd seen his share of moonshine feuds and mine accidents, but nothing quite like this. Ruth Barlow was brought in from home, her face ashen, clutching a worn Bible and the twins' matching Sunday dresses like talismans. She didn't scream or faint. She just stood there in the yard, eyes fixed on the misty ridges, whispering prayers in the old mountain cadence that blended scripture with half-remembered charms against the unseen. Vernon sat on the porch steps, rocking slightly, repeating the same broken story. He described how the girls had slipped out while he slept, drawn by something sweeter than any lullaby. How the hollow had felt alive, breathing cold air that smelled of turned earth and something metallic, like old blood in the mine shafts. The scratches on his arms and face told their own tale. Some looked like briar tears, others too precise, too parallel, as if delicate fingers had raked him in panic or play. He swore he'd heard them calling until the very end, their voices fading together into the laurel hells where no man could follow without risk of never returning. Search parties formed before dusk, men moving in lines through the undergrowth, calling the girls' names in unison. Dogs picked up a scent at the tent site but lost it at the creek, whimpering and refusing to cross. Lantern light flickered between the trees all night, voices echoing like a grim chorus. But as the hours stretched into days, the hollow gave up nothing. No torn clothing, no small footprints preserved in the mud, no sign that two 12-year-old girls had ever wandered its paths beyond that single faint shoe print. Vernon's ramblings grew quieter, but no less disturbing. In the quiet moments between searches, he'd stare toward the white oak and mutter about how the land remembers every Barlow who'd ever claimed it, and sometimes it collects. The community listened, at first with pity for a grieving father, then with the slow, uneasy stirrings of doubt that always creep into isolated mountain towns when something defies explanation. Because in Appalachia, where coal dust and folklore run deep in the veins, people knew the woods could be unforgiving, but they also knew that sometimes what the hollow took, it kept. And on that second night, as searchers regrouped around a new fire, faint laughter seemed to drift down from the ridges. Two voices, sweet and identical, carried on the wind like a distant echo of the Barlow twins singing their schoolhouse hymns. Or maybe it was only the mountains playing tricks, the way they always had. The search stretched into 2 long, exhausting weeks that felt like months in the slow rhythm of mountain time. Every dawn brought fresh volunteers, miners with calloused hands, farmers who knew every deer trail, even women from the nearby holler carrying baskets of cornbread and strong coffee to keep the men going. They combed the ridges, dragged the cold creek with grappling hooks, and pushed deep into laurel thickets so dense they earned their old name, Laurel Hells. Bloodhounds howled and circled, but always returned empty, tails tucked as if the land itself refused to surrender its secrets. The white oak stood unchanged, its branches now seeming to mock the searchers with their silent spread. Ruth Barlow aged 10 years in those 14 days, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her eyes hollowed by endless prayer and the crushing weight of not knowing. She refused to leave the area, sleeping in a borrowed wagon near the trailhead, clutching the twins' identical braids she had cut from their hairbrushes as if the strands could somehow call them home. Vernon became a ghost of the man who had once driven his laughing daughters up that rutted road. He joined every search at first, but his presence soon unsettled the others. He would stop suddenly in the middle of a line, head tilted as if listening to voices only he could hear, then whisper the same fractured words. What the hollow took, it called him by name. His scratches had scabbed over into pale lines that crisscrossed his arms and face like a map of some private torment. Whispers began in the community long before anyone spoke them aloud. In tight-knit Appalachian towns of 1952, where survival depended on trust and shared labor, unexplained tragedy often turned inward. Men who had hunted beside Vernon for years now avoided his eyes, women crossing themselves when he passed. Old tales resurfaced around supper tables. Stories of the Barlow family curse, of how the hollow had claimed kin before during hard winters or after the big flood of '37. Some said Vernon must have done something in the dark that night, Others believed the land itself had grown jealous of the little family's brief happiness and simply reached out with misty fingers to take what it wanted. By the end of the second week, the official search was called off. Sheriff Wilkes closed his notebook with a heavy sigh, muttering that the girls had likely wandered too far, fallen into an old mine shaft, or been taken by the creek after a sudden rain. But no one truly believed it. The hollow had swallowed them without a trace, just as Vernon had babbled from the beginning. Ruth returned to their small frame house at the mouth of the holler, but the rooms felt too large now, the silence deafening without the twins finishing each other's sentences or chasing through the yard. Vernon rarely spoke anymore. He sat on the porch for hours, staring toward the distant ridges where the white oak stood hidden in mist, his hands trembling as he carved tiny wooden whistles that he would never give to his daughters. The accusations grew sharper as autumn deepened, and the leaves fell like blood on the ground. At the small Baptist church where the family had once worshipped together, sermons began to carry veiled warnings about sin hiding in plain sight. A few neighbors stopped speaking to Vernon altogether. One night in early November, a group of men from the old coal camp paid him a quiet visit. Words were exchanged in low voices, ugly words born of fear and grief. Vernon did not fight back. The next morning, Ruth found him in the barn, hanging from a rafter by a length of rope he had used many times to tie down loads in his truck. In his pocket was a crumpled note written in the careful, uneven hand of a man who had left school after the 8th grade. "I never hurt them. The hollow called their names, and they went, laughing. I tried to follow, but it pushed me back with scratches and whispers. Tell Ruth I'm sorry I couldn't bring our girls home. What the hollow takes, it keeps forever. Forgive me." The funeral was small and tense. Ruth stood alone at the grave, the community divided between pity and suspicion. Some whispered that Vernon's suicide was proof of guilt. Others saw it as the final act of a broken father whose mind had shattered under the weight of the unspeakable. The house at the mouth of the holler stood empty within a year. Ruth moved back to her people in Virginia, carrying only a small bundle containing the twins' Sunday dresses and the wooden whistles her husband had never finished. But Barlow Hollow refused to let the story die. Over the decades that followed, hunters and hikers occasionally reported strange encounters near the white oak. Faint laughter drifting through the mist, two young voices, sweet and perfectly matched, singing old hymns or calling daddy in playful tones that turned chilling at dusk. Some claimed to see two small figures in faded dresses darting between the trees, identical braids swinging, only to vanish when approached. Others spoke of sudden cold spots and the feeling of being watched by something ancient that remembered every soul who had ever tried to claim the land. Local newspapers ran occasional pieces on the Barlow twin mystery, but as the 1950s gave way to the turbulent 1960s and beyond, the story settled into the fabric of Appalachian folklore, passed down around campfires and front porches alongside tales of haints, Mothman sightings, and the enduring power of the mountains themselves. Even today, if you drive the old rutted roads deep into that part of Appalachia and ask the right questions of the old-timers still clinging to their family land, they will lower their voices and tell you the hollow is still hungry. They will warn you not to camp alone near the white oak when the leaves turn flame red in October. And if the wind carries the sound of two girls laughing in perfect harmony, they say, you should turn back quickly, because some things the mountains take, they never give back. The Barlow family line faded with Ruth's passing years later, childless and carrying grief like a second shadow. Yet the mystery endures, a quiet reminder of how thin the line can be between the known world of coal trucks and one-room schoolhouses and the older, wilder forces that have always moved through these hollers. Vernon Barlow staggered out of the darkness that October morning in 1952, covered in scratches and broken truths. What he left behind was not just two vanished daughters, but a question that still echoes whenever the mist rolls thick through Barlow Hollow. What exactly did the hollow take? And is it still holding them, laughing softly in the dark, waiting for the next family foolish enough to believe the land belongs to us instead of the other way around? The mountains keep their secrets well, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear two identical voices calling from the laurel thickets, sweet and clear and forever 12 years old.